Hey, Newbie Dan here. This is part 1 of a new video series on how to tune up your table saw. In this video, I'll show you how to align your table saw's blade to the miter track. The next video, part 2, shows how to align your fence to the blade. You should always align your blade to the miter track first before aligning the fence to the blade. So that's why this video is first. Along the way, I'll share some lessons I've learned to help you avoid some common pitfalls and a troubleshooting guide if you find yourself stuck. So stick around. I've intentionally adjusted my blade so that it isn't parallel to the miter track. So the first thing we'll do is measure how much it's out of alignment. After that, we'll adjust it to make it parallel. Here's a quick overview of how to check the blade's alignment to the miter track. I've replaced the blade with this board. I'll explain why in a minute. This is a dial indicator and I've got it pressed against the board. The dial indicator is screwed into this simple jig made from a 2x4, and the jig is clamped to a miter gauge. If you don't have a miter gauge, I'll give you some options in a bit. So, time to measure. I tap the board a few times to make sure everything's settled, and then I zero the miter gauge. So I'm going to move everything to the other end and see if the gauge reads 0. If it does, the blade is parallel. Measure from the same spot on the board, tap it a few times. The gauge does not read 0, so this means we're 0.04 of an inch out. So let's get down to the details. First, we need to pick a miter track. Assuming your saw has 2 miter tracks like this, it's possible that the miter tracks aren't exactly parallel. So choose the miter track you use most often. For me, that's the track on the right. Now we need a miter gauge, or at least something that can fit in this track and hold our 2x4 jig, like this. I'll discuss options like this later on. Whatever you use, it's important that it fits snugly in the miter track, with no wobble or play. I'll cover this in more detail in the lessons learned section in a few minutes. This is a dial indicator that I got from Amazon. As with most everything else, there's a link in the description. And yes, that's what it's called, a dial indicator. Terrible name. Anyway, the gauge shows how much this pin is pressed in. This one's digital, obviously, but you could get an analog one like this that I got from Harbor Freight a while back. Personally, I think the digital one is easier to read. We need some way to attach the dial indicator to the miter gauge, and we use a simple jig for that. I'm not even sure it qualifies as a jig, but that's what I'm going to call it. This is a piece of 2x4. I trimmed the sides to make it look cleaner. It's about 10.5 inches long, give or take. You could ignore the slanted side if you want, we won't be using it here. I cut a notch in the end here about 3 inches long, and this part is about 1 inch thick. I'll attach the dial indicator here. In part 2, when we check the fence, I'll attach the dial indicator here, like that. Lastly, we'll need a board like this, which we'll use instead of the blade. It might seem strange to use a board instead of a blade. After all, a piece of wood couldn't possibly be as straight as a metal blade, right? It turns out that doesn't matter, as long as the board is clamped down tight in the arbor. Let me explain. When we measure from one spot on the board, then rotate the board to the other side and measure again from the same spot on the board, then the board could be significantly curved and we'd still get accurate readings. The big advantage of using the board is that it allows us to have a larger distance between 2 measuring points. With the blade, we measure between these 2 points. The board, on the other hand, lets us measure between these 2 points, which are significantly further apart. This means that any differences will be exaggerated, making them easier to detect. This is a tried and true method, and it works. At the end of the video, I'll provide some resources where you can read about this method. This particular board is made out of a scrap piece of 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood. It doesn't need to be Baltic birch, anything that's sturdy is fine. It's about 10 inches long and about 2.5 inches wide. This is a 5/8 inch hole, which is the diameter of my arbor. I think this is the standard arbor size for a 10-inch table saw, but yours might be different. The center of the hole is 1¼ inches from both sides and the end. And finally, draw a line down the center on each side. You'll see why in a moment. So, let's get down to it. Once you double check to make sure the saw is unplugged, Pull out the blade and replace it with the board. Tighten it down enough so it doesn't move around. Now put the miter gauge in the track. Again, if you don't have a miter gauge, just keep watching. Attach the dial indicator to the jig with a screw. Attach it right here. Attach it tight enough so it doesn't move around, and leave enough room so that if this moves when the pin is pushed in, it doesn't hit here. Since this is a digital gauge, I'll have to turn it on. The analog one obviously doesn't have to be turned on. Place the jig against the miter gauge and position it so the pin is against the board so it moves in some. The pin just needs to move in enough so you're sure you're getting valid readings at both ends. Then clamp the jig to the miter gauge. Make sure it's good and solid. It's also actually a good idea to make sure that it's flat on the table. Just gives it a little more stability. I'm going to clamp my iPhone to the jig so I can give you a top-down close-up of the gauge. There, that should work. Position everything so that the dial indicator's pin hits the board on the center line. Now we're ready to start measuring. Make a mark on the board where the pin is so you know exactly where you're measuring from. Before taking any measurements, tap the board a few times to make sure that everything's settled. The next step is to zero out the gauge. For the analog gauge, you spin this outer bezel until the pin lines up with 0. For the digital gauge, you just press the 0 button. And it doesn't always work. That shows you how sensitive the gauge is, so we're just going to settle for that. Hey, I think I got it. Finally, rotate the board to the other side, moving the gauge along with it. Position the pin so it's on the same spot on the board where you made your mark. Tap the board a few times and check the measurement again. If it doesn't read 0, then your blade isn't aligned to the miter track. I'll discuss some tips later on, but one thing I always make sure is move everything back and make sure that we read 0 or as close as we can here. If this is off by a significant amount, then you've got some play somewhere that you need to deal with. Again, I'll give you some tips on that later on. So we move it back one more time. And we got about the same reading, give or take. The gauge shows how much the blade is misaligned. A positive number means this end of the blade is closer to the miter track than the other end. You can verify that by lightly pressing the board towards the miter track and watch as the numbers increase. As I pull the board away from the miter track, the number decreases. So if this end was further away from the miter track, the number would have been negative. Before we go on, let's step back a moment so I can show you some really important lessons I learned the hard way. When you take a measurement, you must be absolutely sure that the miter gauge is settled into the track and that it doesn't change position. There's 3 different directions it could move. It might move up and down like this makeshift miter gauge does, which is probably not an issue as long as the readings stay the same. Or just make sure not to rock it. It might move side to side like this crappy miter gauge that came with my saw stop. Moving side to side is really bad. If you have a choice, buy or make a miter gauge that doesn't do this. I'll cover these options later on so we don't get sidetracked right now. If you absolutely must use a miter gauge with side-to-side movement, and I strongly recommend against it, then keep it pressed to one side of the miter track or the other whenever you take a reading. Make sure you use the same side of the track for each reading. This side or this side. Double check the readings, then check them again and pray. If you have trouble getting your blade aligned right, this is the first place I'd look for problems. If you remember, I said there were 3 different directions a miter gauge could move. Well, what's the third way? Well, I talked about front to back and side to side. The third direction is to tilt, like this. I never even thought about this because the jig is flat on the table saw, so why would it tilt? I'm honestly not sure why this makeshift miter gauge tilts, but it does. Maybe the handle gives me too much leverage. Whatever. As you can see, it definitely affects the readings. I didn't even notice this at first. You have no idea how much trouble this caused. So I learned to make sure that the miter gauge is flat on the table before I take any readings. And that's the point here. You need to be absolutely sure you're measuring the same way from one measurement to another, that the gauge is level, not tilted in any way. If needed, it's pressed against the same side of the track. Do it exactly the same for each reading. Believe me, as you start adjusting the alignment, your mind's going to be on other things than whether you're tilting the jig or not. Make sure you can make repeatable measurements every time. If you can't, figure it out now before you go any further. Don't shake it off and tell yourself it won't matter. Trust me, it will matter. I'll give you a sort of troubleshooting guide later on to help out. How do we adjust the blade to bring it back into alignment? Well, this is one of those things that's different from saw to saw. You have to dive into your manual. But in general, the principles are the same. To start off, let's talk about how the blade moves when you adjust it. This is the blade housing, which obviously houses the blade. The housing pivots at one end, kind of like a miter saw. It doesn't move as much as a miter saw, of course, not even close. But like a miter saw, you adjust the angle of the blade at the opposite end of where it pivots. In other words, if it pivots here, you do the adjusting here. So let me give you some examples. My old Ryobi's blade housing pivots at this end. At the other end, at the back of the saw, there are two hex bolts that you loosen to allow you to adjust the alignment. Once you loosen them, you move the blade housing like this to the hopefully correct position, more on that in a moment, and then you retighten the hex bolts. Then you remeasure and hope you got it right, which rarely happens the first time, by the way, so remember to be patient. The saw stop makes it so easy to align the blade to the miter track that I can't even imagine an easier way. The saw stop's blade housing pivots at this end. On the other end, right here is a hex bolt. I don't think you can see it, but it's right there. If you turn the hex bolt one way or another, the angle of the housing changes. And that's all you have to do. No bolts to loosen, then retighten. Just adjust this bolt. Nice. So, let's align it. Once you know which end your blade housing pivots on, that's actually the side you should use when you zero your dial indicator. That's because it won't move nearly as much as the other side, where you do the adjusting. So since my saw stop pivots up here, I'm going to zero out the gauge here. And then I'll move it back down here to the same spot on the board and check the numbers. Oh, forgot to tap it on the other side. Let's do that again. Okay, that looks good. It looks like I'm off by 6/1000ths of an inch, or 65/10,000ths of an inch. For reference, an average human hair is about 1/1000th of an inch, so I'm off by about 6 hairs. I don't know whether that's a lot or not, to tell you the truth. And I need to adjust it this way in order to bring it down to 0. So this side has to move that direction. Well, the obvious question is, how do you know how much to adjust the angle when you're making the adjustment? Well, that depends on whether you can keep the dial indicator in place or not. If you can keep it in place, then just keep an eye on the gauge and make your adjustments until it gets to 0, then remeasure. You may have to do this a few times. For my saw stop, I can't keep the gauge in place because it gets in the way of the adjustment bolt. So I'm going to slide it out of the way. Then I'll adjust the bolt a little and slide the gauge back down to see how I did. I'm going to make small adjustments, being careful not to do too much at once. It's a simple process of trial and error. So let's see, I want to go that way, which means I need to loosen the nut. Oh, that was pretty close the first time. It's just a little bit more. Maybe just a teeny bit more. Trying to get perfect is stupid, but see how that works. Well, I don't know. It looks darn close to 0. 0. 0. Okay, looks good. Well, now that I've got it aligned, I'm going to put the blade back on so I can do a final sanity check. As I said before, using the blade to check for parallel is an error-prone method, but it's still worthwhile to try to see how we did using the blade. I won't necessarily trust the results, but it might help spot something fishy. So with the blade back in, I position the gauge against the blade so it pushes in the pin a little and clamp it in. The pin should be against a flat spot and not on one of the teeth. I'm going to put the iPhone on. Okay, hopefully it'll focus. Sorry that the iPhone video is a little out of focus. Normally I would have reshot it, but as you'll see in a moment, something happened and I think you'd like to see it. Okay, so I'm going to zero it out. And then using that same spot on the other side, same spot on the blade on the other side, I'm going to measure it. Well, that's interesting. It measured 0 just a few minutes ago. Ah, remember I told you about that side-to-side movement? There it is. Okay, so let's go back here. Check that again. I'm going to make sure that I'm holding the miter gauge straight down and zero it. Then that same spot on the other side. The miter gauge held down, and we're pretty close to the same. Off by 1/1000th of an inch with this much vibration and stuff. I'm happy with that. But notice how much it changed when I let go of it. How interesting. So here's what happened. When I attached the iPhone to the miter gauge, well, actually to the jig, its weight caused the miter gauge to lean over to the side. This threw out the readings by around 4/1000th of an inch. When I saw the alignment was off by that much, I knew there was a problem because actually I had checked it before I shot the video and it was close to 0. So this just goes to show how easy it is to get inaccurate measurements. So remember, if something doesn't add up, check it out and figure out what's going on. So dive into your manual and figure out what you have to adjust. Plan on it taking longer than you could possibly imagine and prepare it to be frustrating. I'm not trying to scare you off, just let you know that you need to prepare to have some patience. But here's some tips I hope will help. Only change the angle a little at a time, then remeasure. Otherwise, you could end up putting it way out of alignment and there's no undo button here. Always remember which direction you moved it. Sounds obvious, but it's easy to forget. Consider taking notes. And most importantly, remember my lessons about making sure the measurements are accurate and don't change. And that you don't have an iPhone attached to the jig. So what do you do if you're not getting consistent readings? Here's the troubleshooting guide. If you have bolts that have to be loosened to adjust the alignment, make sure you tighten them back down before checking the measurements. Make sure the alignment doesn't change as you tighten down the bolts. This is probably a fairly common problem. With my Ryobi, I had to intentionally align it past where it should be because I knew it would move when I tightened the bolts down. The rest of the troubleshooting can be worked out starting from here and working over. Is the board tight enough on the arbor? Make sure there's no play here. Does the indicator's pin press in at least a little and have room to move both directions? In other words, it's going to go this way and that way a little bit. Make sure you check it at both measuring positions, here and over here. Is the dial indicator screwed snugly down onto the jig? Make sure it can't wiggle or move. Is the 2x4 jig clamped down good and tight to the miter gauge? Make sure it can't move around. Does the miter gauge fit snugly into the track with no play? Make sure to check all three of those directions like we talked about before. If you end up having problems that aren't discussed here, please talk about them in the comments. Somebody might be able to help, and it might help somebody who's having the same problem. Thanks. A while back I said I'd talk about what options you have if you don't have a miter gauge, or one that doesn't fit snugly in the track. So let's do that. Your first option, and honestly the one that I recommend, is to buy a decent miter gauge. This one from Incra has adjustable wheels in the miter bar, so it can be adjusted to fit many different tracks. You can get it from Rockler or Amazon, but Amazon's cheaper. There's a link in the description. Your second option is to make one, and I don't necessarily mean to make a true miter gauge with a protractor and adjustable angle. You can if you want, of course, and there's certainly some YouTube videos on the subject. What I really mean is you can make something like this. You don't need this handle, by the way. All this is really two pieces of plywood and a miter bar of some kind. It doesn't even have to be a true 90 degrees. As long as the angle doesn't change while you're measuring, it doesn't matter, at least for checking blade alignment. For the miter bar, you have multiple options. You can cut your own if you're so inclined, out of various materials. There's plenty of YouTube videos that show you how. If you've never done it before, it can be a pain in the butt to get it just the right size, so be aware of that. Or you can buy a miter bar. This is a piece of Rockler miter bar that I had left over from a previous project. I don't necessarily recommend this one because most of the time you have to tap and drill your own holes, as you can see there. If you don't mind that, it does in fact work pretty well. It's got set screws that can be adjusted to help it fit in tightly in a lot of different miter tracks. In the past, I've also used zero-play miter bars from Microjig. They seem to work well. Again, links for both types of miter bars are in the description. Well, that's it for part 1. In part 2, we'll make the fence parallel to the blade. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click the thumbs up, leave a comment, consider subscribing. Thanks.